This class is on SFR, or the stimulus to fatigue ratio, which is a concept that is very important, and I'm sure you've heard me mention it a number of times in the program thus far, and maybe, casually define it in short form. But in this class, because it is such an important concept, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the topic and be teaching you everything you need to know about it. First, I have to define what SFR is exactly and help you to understand the concept of it and the fatigue that it can cause, which can be a very big problem, and why that is so problematic for some of you out there who think that fatigue is just a word that sounds like it's no big deal. What do you feel a little tired? That's not a problem, right? But fatigue is actually a very serious concern for people who are serious athletes and are serious about their training, and the SFR is a very important concept to understand. So make sure you watch this class to the very end. The SFR is, of course, an acronym that stands for Stimulus to Fatigue Ratio, which means it is the ratio of the amount of stimulus, which is positive or good, to the amount of fatigue, which is negative or bad. Okay, the stimulus positively impacts your training and gives you pluses in your training or gains, and the fatigue is like a minus, a negative in your training that takes away from your training, or in other words, will kill your gains. Okay, so the stimulus to fatigue ratio is the ratio that you are generating of each in relation to one another, which we can actually place a numeric value on, which I'm going to be teaching you about later. This graph represents an SFR2, or a 1 to 2 stimulus to fatigue ratio, meaning that for every unit or measure of stimulus, you get 2 measures of fatigue. So this ratio is not some abstract concept. It's actually something that you can put real-world numeric values on that has practical training implications, and you can use this for individual exercises and techniques that you are using in your training in order to derive what their SFR is and if it is good or bad, as there are certain numeric values that are good and certain that are bad and will kill your gains. Okay, and so to find that some exercises you may choose to do in your exercise selection may actually produce more stimulus than some other exercises, and thus they are better exercises. But as you continue, you may then begin to notice that some of these exercises that produce more stimulus than others actually produce even more fatigue than the stimulus, and other exercises may produce less stimulus but also even less fatigue than that. Okay, so in the end, the exercise with the greater stimulus but the even greater amount of fatigue may actually not be as efficient or effective or generally beneficial and good as the exercise that gives you less stimulus but also even less fatigue than that, because the exercise that is causing less fatigue is having less of a negative impact on your training and more of a positive one, whereas the exercise that causes more fatigue than stimulus is having more of a negative impact on your training than the positive impact. So the cost of that extra stimulus is not actually justifying having that extra stimulus in this case, because that fatigue is taxing your system. It is like a minus on your account. It is withdrawing energies from your system and thus having a negative impact on your total work output. Okay, the work capacity that you have is being depleted by that fatigue. So if you were to focus on doing more of the exercise that produces less stimulus but even less fatigue, you could then, by adding sets and reps to that exercise or weight to it or doing some sort of progressive overload with it, increase the amount of stimulus that it was having to the amount of stimulus that that other exercise was having with just, one set or whatever you were doing. All right. So you add to it to make its stimulus go up, and you're not getting the amount of fatigue that you had with that first exercise. You're still having less fatigue. So you find that by focusing more on the exercise with the better SFR, even though it didn't have the best stimulus in the first place, it didn't have the same amount of stimulus as some other exercises, by doubling up or tripling up on the amount of sets, you can increase the stimulus to the desired amount. You can even max it out because its fatigue is not going up more than the stimulus. All right. However, if you were to do progressive overload with that first exercise that gives you this much stimulus but this much fatigue, well, the stimulus is going to go up a certain amount, but the fatigue is going to go up exponentially compared to it. All right. So you may not even notice a problem with poor SFR exercises when you first start doing them and you're only doing one set of them. But as you do progressive overload with your exercises, you're not just doing progressive overload with your stimulus, but also with your fatigue. Okay? So if you have exercises where the stimulus and fatigue are equal, they're both going to go up equal to one another and always stay in that same exact ratio, unless the exercise changes and the SFR changes. But if you are doing progressive overload with an exercise that has a bad SFR, meaning that it started out with more fatigue than stimulus, then the fatigue is going to be raising at a rate that is greater than the rate that the stimulus is raising at. And that's what I'm going to be illustrating for you here with this graph a little bit later, is that when you have an exercise with a bad SFR that you do progressive overload with, as you raise the stimulus, the fatigue is going up exponentially more than the stimulus is. So you may not notice the negative impact when you first start doing it and you're only doing one set, but as you continue to add volume and do progressive overload with it, the effects are exponential, okay? And so it can become very problematic to be doing exercises with a bad SFR when you are married to your progressive overload with them and you're just stubbornly pushing forward more and more. And yet when you focus more on exercises with a good SFR or a positive stimulus and negative fatigue ratio, then your stimulus is raising exponential to the fatigue, unless it changes because of some aspects of the training variables changing the SFR. But if it were to continue to raise at the same rate, with the stimulus going up more than the fatigue more and exponentially over time, then you're going to see more and more positive benefits from that. So that's why it's important to focus more on exercises with a positive SFR, more stimulus than fatigue. Just keep in mind that as you do progressive overload and manipulate those training variables, sometimes you may change certain aspects of your exercise regimen that then changes your SFR. So at certain times, you may find that some exercise that used to give you good gains and more stimulus than fatigue is now actually giving you more fatigue than stimulus. This can especially happen when you're focusing more on doing progressive overload with weight and intensity by increasing the loading more than other aspects. So, as you get up into the heavy lifting, you'll notice that heavy lifting causes more fatigue than stimulus. So if you had started by doing 12 or more reps and you're now doing less than 6, that's going to change the SFR. So even if you started with an exercise that had a good SFR and was producing a lot more stimulus than fatigue, that can change. And at a certain point, you might notice that an exercise is now causing more fatigue than stimulus, which would make it an inefficient exercise to continue doing progressive overload with. It is now not helping you more than it is harming you, okay? It is doing more harm than good at that point. So that is why it is so important to be able to evaluate exercises, and I'm going to be actually teaching you a specific mathematical formula that you can use for that in order to derive these numeric values for it.